This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's June 30th, 1978, and it's side one of tape number 332. In 1966, a book came out by Edward J. Epstein called Inquest. It was published by Viking Press in New York. There have been a lot of controversial remarks about Mr. Epstein in later years, attacking Jim Garrison and people investigating the Kennedy assassination, and he recently wrote a total whitewash defending the Warren Commission conclusions. But early in the game, when he came out with a book called Inquest, it was an excellent book. Half of the book was excellent because it showed how the Warren Commission did not do their work of investigating the assassination of John Kennedy. They didn't attend the meetings, they didn't show any interest in the subject, and he has a breakdown of who attended the meetings and how many. The second half of the book goes into the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin. I always call it a schizophrenic book because if the first half of the book were true, that they didn't do their work, then the second and a half of the book wouldn't make any sense. How could they come to the right conclusion if they didn't do their investigation? So he does go into the mechanics of how the Warren Commission was set up. And when you take that alone and ask the question, why didn't they investigate the murder of the Kennedy, forget his conclusions and look for your own and try to find out who these men were on the Warren Commission that put them in a position of pretending to investigate when they really didn't care. Now, I sent out 30 or 40 copies of that book, COD, to various friends in Los Angeles. We had just moved to Carmel in 1965, and this was 66. And I sent them to members of my family, and I had a letter with the book saying, read this book. This won't tell you that the Nazis are going to take over America in the future or the Nazi connections to the John Kennedy assassination. But if you begin to read all these books on the Kennedy assassination, they will lead you to Adolf Hitler and who was behind the murder of the President of the United States. And this is a starting point. Every single one of these people kept the book and paid for it, with the exception of my father's associate, Rabbi Dubin, who sent me back a letter and said there already is a book out on John Kennedy assassination by Thomas Buchanan called Who Killed Kennedy, and therefore he wasn't interested in reading any more. The basis for my opinion, as early as 1966, that the Nazis were involved had to do with various people surrounding Lee and Marina Oswald. One of them was George von Mohrenschildt, who changed his name to de Mohrenschildt, who had been praising Heinrich Himmler at the Petroleum Club. Now, that might have just been an opinion of de Mohrenschildt, and it wasn't certainly hard evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald worked with Nazis as early as 1966. But I had a very strong feeling, by the way the commission was set up and the witnesses that were called, that the Kennedy murder was one of many murders in the past and a piece of history for the future, that he was just fit in a time slot of a particular moment because of his wanting rapprochement or d'entente with the Soviet Union, or following General Eisenhower's desire to have d'entente with Russia, that the Pentagon would be running the show, and that these Nazis who wanted World War II would be retrenching for World War III by killing the leaders as they came along. Another warning of the Nazi movement was Jack Ruby's pleading with Gerald Ford and Leon Jaworski and Earl Warren to tell the truth about what happened, because he said a whole new form of government will come over the United States and that we'll have pogroms in the United States. And a pogrom is, by definition, a slaughter or massacre of Jewish families by Tsarists and Nazis without any provocation or reason except that they happen to be Jews. Now, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there were Nazis that came from Munich, Germany, that joined an organization that was formed for them called Young Americans for Freedom. I didn't know as early as 1966 that William Buckley and Douglas Caddy of Watergate and CIA connections formed the YAF, and the man in the Dallas area who these Nazis met with, Volkmar Schmidt and Larry Schmidt, was Robert Morris, counsel for Richard Nixon's House Internal Security Committee. I didn't know much about the politics of these people when I first started, any more than I knew about Walter Dornberger being a Nazi war criminal and working at Bell Aerospace, and working at Bell with him was Michael Payne, the host of Lee and Marina Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Irving, Texas. Of course, this was just one of early books that was coming out that indicated that something was wrong in the land. Later, in 1975, after the Boston Conspiracy Conference, I sent out letters to various members of Congress and personal letters. I enclosed an insert and for various researchers accusing Mark Lane and Bernard Fensterwald and George O'Toole, who had just coming out with his book, The Assassination Tapes, and Robert Sam Anson, and the Assassination Information Bureau. I guess this was 1976. I sent this letter accusing these people of protecting the Nazi links to the Kennedy assassination, that the Nazis were the bottom line of the murder, and that they're instigating the network all over the world of Nazis, again, centered in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but it had to do with the New Orleans connections of Clay Shaw to world Nazis and the Galen operation, and witnesses that Lee and Marina Oswald saw in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that belonged to the Nazi Galen organization and the Tolstoy Foundation, run by the Central Intelligence Agency. And I accused Lane and Fensterwald, O'Toole, Anson, and AIB, and so forth, as being spokesmen for the various researchers, while at the same time making a concerted effort to conceal what Jim Garrison knew about Clay Shaw and his Nazi connections, and what Sherman Skolnick knew about the Nazis and the various assassinations. That they and myself had to be discredited and put down and ignored, while these other so-called superstars would get books published, do the radio show route, get college lectures, and while they were suppressing information, they appeared to be giving information. But the bottom line has been to suppress the Nazi connections. Before I go into some more about the Nazis and the assassination, specifically the connections of Hjalmar Schacht, the war criminal, and Clay Shaw from New Orleans, and Hjalmar Schacht at Aristotle Onassis, and Schacht with the Worldwide Odessa Organization, and the funding of Adolf Hitler's team after the war, and also funding Adolf Hitler when he came into power. This one man is a very important name, and we're going to go more into him, but I want to fill up a little bit of the week's news and maybe do the whole other side of this tape on Mr. Hjalmar, Hjalmar, Schacht, Schacht. You have to keep an eye for him and look at various books and bibliographies and copy pages about him. Type up from the library and send me all references you have to Mr. Schacht, past and present. Before that, as I say, I want to get into a little bit of the news of the week here, which again goes into the past, because the present is affected by those dogs or animals, I keep referring to them, who have bungled the past and are in control today. The Monterey Herald, our local paper, Wednesday, June 28, 1978, on the television page has a big article, a lead article that's 3/4 of an inch high, 2 columns. I can copy them for you if you want copies. It says, K-Wave buyer says he will exclude Jews from airtime. A K-Wave FM radio station is in Monterey, California. It was bought by James E. Brown, formerly from Cincinnati, and again, your researchers can do some information on him or his past. James E. Brown and Associates. And he has a group of Christian radio stations. He set up in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona. He lives in Phoenix, but he's bought K-Wave in Monterey, California. And what he says that he will exclude all Jews from the station's religious programming. Only Jews who have been converted to Christianity will have any airtime on K-Wave. Now, he's going to continue his classical music. It's our only classical music station on the Monterey Peninsula, so he has a built-in audience that wouldn't boycott the station even if they wanted to. This is from 7 to midnight, 6 days a week. He's going to have religious programs from 6 to 1 and sacred music from 1 to 6. He calls it middle-of-the-road sacred music from 1 to 6. And then his broadcasting ministry service is going to only have Christians, and no Jews will be allowed on K-Wave. Now, I understand that the Federal Communications in Washington said that when he filled out an application, he said that he would not exclude any religious group from programming on the station, that they have to sign an application to not exclude anyone on the basis of religion. But now that the station has been sold to Mr. Brown, he is intending to have only Gentiles or Jews that have converted can use airtime on the Monterey Peninsula. On tape number 329, June 16th, 1978, I talked about the book, the Herbert Hoover Commission Report, and how the National Security Council was formed, and the evils of the National Security Act of 1947 of locating the National Security Council next to the President's office to become, in quotes, to all intents and purposes, part of the presidential office. Last week on the tape, I was denouncing those vile warmongers, Mr. Brzezinski and Mr. Solzhenitsyn, and the advisors to the president who want to get us into a war in Africa and the Middle East. An interesting article came out along those lines about Mr. Brzezinski and the National Security Council, and I only saw it from one source, and I'm going to mention to you, it's from June 1978, from the Christian Science Monitor. Now, this is the only newspaper I've seen this article, and this is, in quotes, what it said. Senator George McGovern has said that he's inclined to favor the abolishing of the position of National Security Advisor to the President, a position currently held by Mr. Brzezinski. They quoted Mr. McGovern saying the National Security Council staff is an agency which is out of control of the Congress and the American people. As chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on International Operations, Senator George McGovern has decided to call for hearings later this summer to look into the question of how foreign policy is determined and how the National Security Council relates to this policy making. Now, this is one of the most important pieces of news that I've been able to put on tapes, and I'll be using it for other radio shows, and I want you people to follow this up and see what we can do about this. Now, summer hearings are a very bad time for Congress. Children are out of school, families are on vacation, there are long summer days for various hobbies before the winter sets in. The House Select Committee has called for summer hearings on open hearings televised on the John Kennedy assassination. I know the House Select Committee was going gung-ho in the Watergate investigations, May, June, July. When they took a break from the summer, all interest was lost. Nobody watched. It went off the television and got buried behind some pages in the government printing office. I think these hearings should be put off. These won't be public hearings, but they should not be where all the congressmen are home for the summer and campaigning for their elections in November. This is possibly one of the most important pieces of information for our future and for our children's future to come into the news for this reason. The foreign policies are determined by the corporations. If we need copper in Zaire, we'll take Zaire. If the Belgian Congo still belongs to the Netherlands, they'll go in and take what they need and send advisors to maintain that their profits come from whatever it is that Zaire we need. If we need coffee and minerals from Uganda, we have Mr. Colby going around saying the CIA or somebody should kill Idi Amin. We don't have them saying about killing the leaders of Brazil, the leaders of Argentina with their death squads, their assassination squads. But if the resources are not controlled by us, if we don't own that country, lock, stock, and barrel, the National Security Advisor put in by David and Nelson Rockefeller, U.S. Steel, General Motors, Ford Motor Company, ITT, is a traveling czarist Nazi front for grabbing world power and world resources, and worst of all, killing off all labor, all fair housing, instigations, all fair projects for giving food to the poor, and health plans. The genocidal policies are done by the Nazis in the White House. I've always said that Henry Kissinger was a Nazi, not a Jewish family. He was just honored down in Argentina this week with a degree and then went off to Brasilia for lunch. And in Brazil, and he is the darling of the Saudi Arabian, Egyptian Nazi clique all over the world. The way our foreign policy is determined is not done by the will of the people. In 50 states, we pay our taxes for these weapons we don't need and the overcost. In 50 states, we send our children and the children's children out to fight battle. In 50 states, we have lost the right to preserve our land, keep it from pollution, get health plans, fair employment, security in the old age, Social Security money running out. We are losing our rights all the time, and they're done because these people, like Mr. Brzezinski and advisors like Solzhenitsyn and Kissinger, are part of a foreign clique. They're not even Americans, and they are the people that make our foreign policy. The corporations make the policies, and when the will of the people is there, it will go through various congressmen if they're not paid by Howard Hughes and the Korean CIA and their bloody payoffs from overseas money that comes back here through these money skimming and laundering processes. So this is very important to write to Senator George McGovern and say we're all for getting Mr. Brzezinski not only out of the White House but out of the country. I would hang him by his heels like Mussolini, but it's a start to know who determines the way that we go to war, invade countries, and how they run the White House. As I mentioned before on the tape, on the National Security Council, formed in 1947, which I said was formed by the Gestapo and Reinhard Gehlen and Allen Dulles and the spy systems with all the clauses for them to kill or do whatever they want. When you break down how this was structured, you can rebuild a country based on checks and balances. There was a report this week that you might or might not have seen, a report from the National Transportation Safety Board that U-2 spy pilot Francis Gary Powers crashed to his death because he mismanaged, in quotes, his fuel supply for his helicopter. If you believe that, you believe that 17 cows are going to jump over the moon tonight. The plane crashed August 1st, 1977, just a short time after the so-called suicide of George de Mohrenschildt, and also a short time after the House Select Committee began their investigation of the assassination of John Kennedy. And then the linear connection, again, of Gary Powers to those infamous Nazis that I talk about all the time, because that Powers said that he believed Lee Harvey Oswald had downed his U-2 plane to break up the Détente over the Soviet Union. Now, Oswald worked at a radio factory run by Alexander Zeiger, who introduced him to the infamous czarist bitch Marina Oswald, the notorious agent of the intelligence community, the Tolstoy Foundation, and the CIA Greek Orthodox Church. The CIA wanted to bring Alexander Zeiger's children to Argentina after the assassination of John Kennedy. The Soviet Union has Reinhard Gehlen's agents inside Russia. He was brought from Argentina to the Minsk radio factory. I don't know why the Soviets let him in, but certainly inside the Soviet Union are these deep cover spies working Nazis of the Gehlen operation passed off as KGB or officials. I don't know how Zeiger and his family got back from Argentina to Minsk. You would think that the Russians and their KGB and NKV and NKD would be so sharp that they would not bring back people from Argentina to a strategic place like Minsk. But one explanation of allowing these Nazis back is to keep track of them and who they know. And the Odessa, the spider organization run by these various Nazis, maybe they brought him back here, Zeiger, from Argentina to the radio factory with their permission. They allowed Soviet woman Marina Oswald, a czarist, to be close to Alexander Zeiger. Lee Harvey Oswald met Marina through Zeiger, and of course, if the Soviet spy system kept track of this triangle of Marina, Lee, and Zeiger, they had the goods on the United States. And one thing I hope is that if Mr. Brzezinski tries to get us into another war in Africa or Middle East, that the Soviet Union will begin to expose some pieces of this puzzle that they must know about and try to stop this madness of escalating the war one more time. Another witness that was murdered who had Nazi connections to the assassination, who worked with the Nazis and the World Odessa, was William Sullivan of Division 5 of the FBI. Now, William Kunstler, the lawyer, is claiming that the fatal shooting of William Sullivan had to do with his testifying against Patrick Gray and Mark Felt and Edward Miller, men that were arrested, FBI agents high up in the FBI who've been arrested. And Mr. Kunstler claims that they would have their case tightened up if Sullivan had lived to testify against them. But I don't believe that William Sullivan was shot because of the testimony against FBI officials. I believe he was shot because more and more material is coming out about Permindex and the links of William Sullivan to Division 5 and George de Mohrenschildt and the assassination. And the big story in the country isn't really the fact that 3 FBI men illegally took documents or wiretapped the Weathermen in New York City. I think that they could stand trial on that and have a fair shake, and under the guise of national security get probation and a slap on the wrist. I don't think there's any reason to shoot William Sullivan with a .30-06 deer rifle bullet in New Hampshire last November just because Patrick Gray, Mark Felt, and Edward Miller might get a slap on the hand. I think that William Sullivan was shot because of his knowledge of the whole international assassination teams that have been set up for years and still are working to this day. Again, Mark Lane and William Kunstler and these various people pass themselves off as liberals who represent the underdog and the weak members of our society, and I accuse them really of concealing the Nazification of the world since World War II. Those are pretty strong charges, but I really believe that they go through a facade of caring while the world is becoming Nazi. Interesting, Clay Shaw, at the time he was arrested by Jim Garrison, was described as an old-fashioned liberal. The various people said, how would you describe him? And he said, well, he was a liberal of the Wilson-Roosevelt persuasion. He was a Stevensonian liberal. He stood by and admired Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Adlai Stevenson, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He had the facade, like, say, a Kunstler Lane, of caring about the Vietnamese, the Indians, the underdog, Lee Harvey Oswald, or James Earl Ray. But strangely enough, when it comes to the push and shove, they are protecting the Nazis, and they get violent against a person who suggests that Nazis were involved in the assassination. Clay Shaw worked with the highest Nazis of World War II right up until the time of his death, but on the surface he was known as an art person in New Orleans who reconstructed the old French Quarter and kept a political facade of being a left-ish kind of a Democrat. His actual connections were with the extreme rightist murdering dogs, so that who people associate with or dine with or vote for or what they say isn't really as important as who they protect, who they attack, and what they do, how they're funded, and the modus operandi with which they move. There's a new movie out, which I have not seen. I've only read reviews of it, but some of you who get these tapes are lucky enough to be in big cities to get some of these foreign movies, and I'll have to go to San Francisco to see this. I'm sure it will never play in Carmel, Monterey. The movie is called Lucio Flavio, The Passenger of Agony. And again, getting back to the Nazi theme that you will hear me mentioning over and over again probably with everything we talk about on these tapes. Flavio was murdered in a cell in Brazil in 1975. He was very much a part of the death squad and knew about the activities of the death squad. He had committed murders and burglaries. He was no saint. But when he was in jail, he dictated certain letters before his death to a reporter. And the reporter took these letters, and they are the result of these letters is a movie about the death squad in Brazil. Now, these death squads were started 20 years ago. The old idea of a trial and courts and juries and judges has been thrown out since Nazi Germany. Certainly there were a lot of countries where there were never fair trials before. But Brazil was a big center of evacuation of many Nazis. So from the 1944-45 up to 58, it gave them a lot of time to be entrenched into the presidency with the coup that took place the same year after John Kennedy was killed. The coup took place in 64 with a military dictatorship. And of course, it is the home of Nazis that became entrenched immediately into the government and police forces of Brazil. The police lead these vigilantes. The purpose of them is to hunt any leftists or subversives or guerrillas. There's no more monkey trials like there were in Germany. Remember, the courts were perversed and turned around to make the innocent look guilty and the guilty out on the streets. In Brazil and in many countries, Argentina has these death squads. The United States has the death squads. They just go out and kill them. That's what the criminal conspiracy section in the intelligence system of Los Angeles police, California prison system, kill certain people like George Jackson, and various men are locked up in prison for the rest of their lives. They'll be lucky if they get out, like Hugo Pinell, the organizer, and there are many attempts to kill him. But this movie is about the death squads and how the police supply the weapons to known criminals and organize bank robberies and kill various people off who are leftists. The important thing about this movie is that until recently, the middle class in Brazil was perfectly happy with the death squads, just like the middle class in America is perfectly happy with various political leaders being gunned down, and also then their killers like Lee Harvey Oswald being shot right afterwards. That's a death squad in the United States where you don't need a court trial for Lee Harvey Oswald. You get rid of him fast. Witnesses to trials such as Gary Powers, George de Mohrenschildt, Carlos Prios Sequeiros, these various people, William Sullivan, are killed by our American death squads. Well, this movie is about the Brazilian squads that have been going on for 20 years. Sergio Paranos Fleury is the head of the death squad division. He's been tried publicly several times through publicity for the murder of a particular offender 10 years ago. He was indicted 22 times for death squad executions, but he never has gone to jail, and he's still acquitted of all charges. His most famous death in Brazil was Carlos Marighella, who wrote a book on organizing for leftists that was later put in the hands of the CIA SLA members as a mockery. And of course, those 6 people were burned alive in Los Angeles by the Los Angeles Police Department death squad. See the movie Lucio Flavio, The Passenger of Agony, and realize that this isn't just in Brazil, that this is happening all over the world, and that everywhere you investigate it, you're going to find the Nazis behind these organizations that are doing the killings all the way up to the top. In fact, Hugo Pinel said that the prison guards, I believe it was Hugo, one of the men testifying at the San Quentin 6 trial, said that guards at San Quentin had Nazi uniforms and pictures of Adolf Hitler right in their prison offices. This is in the trial transcript of the San Quentin 6. Warren Burger, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, the infamous attorney who originally flew to California to change the new Constitution and eliminate trial by jury, was the leading author of the 4-3 decision this week that the news media has limited access to prisons and mental institutions in the United States. U.S. Supreme Court ruled that public officials can place strict limits on the rights of the press and public to investigate situations in prisons and mental institutions, not only in California, where the case first came up, but throughout the entire nation. KQED and other newspapers wanted to go into the Santa Rita prison here in Alameda County to see if there were inhumane conditions and what the maximum security section is like in that prison. But Warren Burger wrote that, as the majority opinion, he said in quotes, "The news media has no right of access beyond that of any other public person to interview inmates or to film or to record any conditions in any jail or mental institutions." KQED's news director, George Osterkamp, said this decision is, in quotes, "a major setback." He said it's unrealistic because the public and the taxpayers will never find out what goes on inside their prisons. If press access is limited, we will never know, because if we have the same rights as the general public, that means that you simply go in, sometimes stay behind bars, prisoners are brought chained to a window, and you can't photograph the conditions or have any idea what goes on in mental hospitals or prisons. Now, here's an interesting comment on that decision. Of course, Chief Justice Burger and William Rehnquist of the CIA voted to limit the press. Remember that Nixon's court now is making these decisions, 4-3 decisions, over and over and over again. The Bakke decision, this white, they describe him as this Nordic white engineer, put in by the YAF, encouraged through NASA. He works at NASA, which was originally formed with Nazis that came over here from Germany, told to run in the medical school contest, even though he was in his 30s, to get in. Mr. Bakke won his decision by the same Supreme Court. Watch these decisions coming down now. One of the decisions of this limiting access to the prisons, in quotes, Mr. Stewart said, "A person touring Santa Rita can grasp its reality with his eyes and ears, but if a television reporter is to convey the jail sights and sounds, he must use cameras and sound equipment." They went on to say that the courts may further consider the constitutional role of the press and the institutional requirements of jail. I think this is important because you as taxpayers have to live both with the people who are locked up and the people who come out, what are they like when they come out? What is it like to live in there? What are the conditions? In California alone, there's 27,000 people living in prisons, in the California prison system. Right now, 27,000, and the press cannot see the conditions of those institutions. And in addition, there are many, many thousands in mental hospitals, and now we learn that they don't have the right to go into photograph and take conditions of the mental hospitals where so many people have died, and those investigations were hushed up this last year. On side 2 now, we'll go into Mr. Hallmark shocked, Clay Shaw and the Kennedy assassination. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's June 30th, 1978. This is tape number 323, and it's side 2. On side 1, we went into some current headlines in the news, and now I want to give you the names of various books that I'm reading and synchronizing at the present time. It would be impossible to go at depth into each one of these books on any particular side of a tape. But if I turn you onto these books with the authors and the publications, hopefully then you can get them at your library. And I will be sharing certain names with you that are important through future tapes and in correspondence and in telephone calls, because I want you to know the area which I'm working at all the time. And as I put this material together, I think that an excellent book to write for me to begin writing in the fall is probably the Nazi connections to the political assassinations, and put all of this in book form. I don't know why I didn't think of the printed sheet out years ago, the printed sheet that goes with the tapes that you get now by subscription, because it's a good way to follow the program, and I should have had listeners be able to write in for books instead of leaving it up to them to call or to write me letters. There are several books here of the Argentine connections, the Nazi connections of Clay Shaw, and I just want to run down on this side the titles and a section of each book to show you how these pieces are coming together. One book is called Were We Controlled? It's by Lincoln Lawrence. That's a pseudonym for Arthur Ford. I think he's surfaced now enough that people know who that is. And it's called The Assassination of President Kennedy. And there's allegations in this book that Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby were under the mind control of a large operation, a Nazi organization. This book came out in 1967. University Books published it. Tom Davis of Research has copies if you want to buy them from him. His address is on the sheets that you have. On page 105 of Were We Controlled, it goes into a manipulation of the stock market when John Kennedy was killed. Briefly, what Arthur Ford is saying, alias Lincoln Lawrence, is that there was a scheme to manipulate the New York Stock Exchange. According to the rumor, several controlled people would be prepared to carry out assassinations, or in this case, patsies. And according to the rumor, Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation, headed by Anthony Tino De Angelis, was chosen to be the instrument to rock the very foundations of the world commodity market. It seemed that the day that John Kennedy was killed, that certain persons had foreknowledge of the event, and that's how they turned to investigating the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Company to see who gained and who lost, because several organizations or businesses made millions of dollars the day Kennedy was killed. On page 115, he goes on, it was 1954 that Tino De Angelis came to the attention in Germany of the group that was to figure in the rumor later, the assassination group. It had to do with what was known as a grain caper, briefly called Operation Control. The pocket money went for Operation Control for the grain caper. It involved $55 million worth of barley, corn, and sorghum that was to be shipped to Austria for Germany and Austria firms by half a dozen American exporters. And somehow half of it didn't get there. And he asked the question, how do you lose $30 million worth of grain? You do it, it turns out, with well thought out international control operations with numerous dummy corporations, Swiss bank accounts, one German firm in Hamburg, which was a big new customer of a man named Tony De Angelis. They had walking around money between $3 and $5 million to work with, and they worked with great precision. One of the 51 companies which was either lent money to Allied or deposited oil at its Bayonet plant was the Bunge Corporation. And the Bunge Corporation had headquarters in New Orleans and was directly linked through exposés later to persons who were familiar with Clay Shaw and his Galen agents in the New Orleans area. He says the Bunge Corporation, dubbed the Octopus, would make a delightful corporate villain for a James Bond fantasy. We all know about DuPont, General Motors, Standard Oil, but Bunge, unless you're the grain business or fats or oil, it's very anonymous. In terms of dollars or cents, it does $2 billion worth of business each year in 80 countries, 110 offices linked in the most extraordinary manner by leased channels, telex and private. Remember, private, under the ocean telegraph cables. Their bill for communications alone in 1976 was $500,000 a year. The group is particularly careful about their communications facility, utilizes the most private, lightning-fast means, setting up a network that would be impossible for the group to do without. The American Bunge Corporation, according to Lincoln Lawrence, is a privately held giant, financially controlled by a group of shareholders whose headquarters are in Argentina. The consistently Germanic tone in the structure of the rumor finds a familiar echo in the profile of Bunge that was in Business Week. You can look this up, October 19, 1963. The company is closed-mouthed about their financial affairs. Members of the Born family in Argentina are believed to be the biggest shareholders. The Bunge and Born founders emigrated from Europe to Argentina. The directors are naturalized immigrants or second-generation Argentinians of Belgian and German descent. Director Leon Mainzer emigrated from Germany. Pardon our recurring German note, but the rumor has it that Mr. One and his companions were mostly German that were involved in these conspiracies. Bunge had everything: a German influence in its home base of Argentine, super flexibility in world communications, tremendous assets, and strong influence with connections with Allied and Tino Angelis. Bunge, like the Allied and Tino Angelis, had nothing to gain and everything to lose by an involvement in the group, but he goes on to say that they used Angelis as a front for their operations and for the assassination plans that were to take place in Texas. He refers to the banks in this book and the soybean market and the manipulation of the stock market the day that John Kennedy died. I'm not going into the whole section on the manipulation and the Nazis, except to say that the heavy Argentine connections, the German-Belgian connections, come up in connection to the corporation that had its headquarters in New Orleans, where Clay Shaw worked. On tape 327, June the 9th, I gave you the bibliography for Paris Flamon's book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, and I also read you part of the sections from the establishment of Centro Mondial Commercial. That was the organization that funded Permindex, with headquarters in Montreal and Italy and in Switzerland. And Ferenc Nagy, the former Hungarian premier, became the president of Permindex and then shows up in Dallas, Texas at the time of the assassination. This book also goes into other members of the board of directors of Permindex, including one particular man whose name I'll be using many times, Hjalmar Schacht. I've printed it for you, the spelling on the layout, who was a war criminal in Nuremberg, and along with him on the board of directors is Clay Shaw of New Orleans from the International Trademark. The goal of this group is concealed. There have been many investigations, not many, but a few, into Centro Mondial Commercial. As Flamon said, its origins, functions, rotating presidents, geographical displacements, alternate designations were so complex and labyrinth to make a comprehensive and comprehensible description of it anything less than a moderate-sized book. It would be impossible. We have the Bunge Corporation, this large Argentine-German operation that involves billions of dollars, named in one book as being part of a plan to kill John Kennedy, and it is linked to the Nazi network in Belgium and Germany. And then down in New Orleans, along with the bunch, is Mr. Clayshaw and Mr. Hallmark Schacht. I also gave you a bibliography of the book Galen, Spy of the Century, where it tells that as soon as Israel became a country in May of 1948, by July of 48, Mr. Skerensky, the war criminal, was sent to Egypt along with Mr. Schacht. He was the father-in-law. Skerensky was the father-in-law of Dr. Hallmark Schacht, Hitler's financial wizard, the man that put Hitler into office. And they began to infiltrate the countries, the Middle East countries, and set up the Nazis as soon as Israel, as I say, became a country. I think they would have done it to take over Africa and the Middle East after World War II, with or without Israel being a country. But it goes on in this book on Spy of the Century to tell how the Nazis were taken from Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Spain, and then went on to work with Mr. Nasser of the Bormann Brotherhood, linked to the worldwide Nazi Odessa organization, and get their tentacles immediately by 1948 into the Middle East and Africa. Another book that I gave reference to, I just gave the title, but I have not given at length much information on it, is this fascinating book by Joe Jostin. It's called The Fabulous Greek Onassis. I can't emphasize too many times how I'll be reading books continuously now on the Antarctica, on Aristotle Onassis, the Nazi Party, and the rebuilding of Germany after World War II, because in this triangle from Germany to Argentina and Washington, D.C. is the answer to all of the assassinations and all of the conspiracies that have taken place since. It's the answer to Whittaker Chambers from Germany working under cover of Henry Luce and discrediting Alger Hiss. It's the answer to the Rosenberg trial and many of the missing pieces. The same lawyers work through these various assassinations. The same judges reappear. The same Justice Department concealing evidence and material evidence being destroyed that would alter the course of history. All the dirty little techniques that Hitler used to get into office and that were just thrown out when he declared a total dictatorship in 1933 are being used in the United States. Now, in this book, The Fabulous Greece by Jostin, which does not have a date, it's an interesting thing. He wrote this, and it's got a picture of Jackie Onassis on the cover. It's published by Tower Publications and undated, and it goes into a lot of really good research. And then the last chapters are written very hastily, almost as if Jostin's family or somebody got the book out, but that he didn't write these two chapters. Because I can't believe that he didn't make the connections of Aristotle Onassis to some of the world powers that later were to affect the Kennedy assassination. If Jostin was the first person to write Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy, I can't believe that he didn't make some of these connections when Kennedy was killed. I don't know. He interviewed Aristotle Onassis, and I think the bulk of this book was written long before Onassis died, and certainly the last chapter about the wedding to Jackie seemed to be just slapped on and not the same investigative kind of work that Jostin did. But he goes into the rebuilding of the German fleets and the Japanese fleets after World War II, and he credits Aristotle Onassis with rebuilding their shipyards that were laying low in mothballs and giving them the contracts of building his ships. And Onassis, of course, used all German crew. They all spoke German. And he goes into the deals that he wanted to make with oil companies in Arabia and Iraq. And his works with the Arabian oil companies is a chapter called Onassis Quits Whaling, which was when he was caught with illegal methods of catching whales down in Antarctica, that area. It goes into Onassis signing up a Norwegian expert in 1950, a member of the Quisling team who worked for him. He said he followed the advice of various German friends, and he took on with him a man who had worked for the Nazis before World War II, worked in Hitler's armed forces when they took over his country in Norway, and he was a member of Norwegian trader Vidkun Quisling's group. He was the person that Aristotle Onassis trusted and took on the ship with him when he did the whaling. Later, he sells his whaling operation to the Japanese and German. But when he builds up his oil tanker fleet, he rebuilds Germany. But not only does he do that, but there's a chapter 12 on page 151 titled, "Look Who's Here, Dr. Hallmar Shocked." It seems that Aristotle Onassis began working with old King Ibn Saud, who was described as a cruel and vicious despot, but beloved by the American oil companies. In 1933, he worked with the American oil companies and started the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco. And after he got that started, he began to meet with Aristotle Onassis, his head oil people, to make deals to carry the oil away from Saudi Arabia in Onassis's tankers. Ibn Saud died in November 9th, 1953, immediately succeeded by Crown Prince Saud, and Justin says it's quite natural that the old man could have died a natural death, but he's suspicious at that particular time in 53 when he passed away. There's some suspicion here that he probably was done in for the oil rights. But a Mohammed al-Razi, who is in charge of all the oil leasing in the Middle East, was meeting at the Plaza Athénée, and he was meeting with Hallmar Shocked, the ex-Nazi Minister of Finance, and these various sheiks, and they were working with an unnamed principal in the carting of this oil, and that principal, of course, was Aristotle Onassis. In quotes, Mohammed al-Razi told me he had acted as an interpreter because the Minister of Finance did not speak English or German, but they had concluded that Shock's unnamed principal was in fact Onassis, and they sent Shock to see the Minister of Finance. Shock was acting on the behalf of Aristotle Onassis and setting up arrangements with this Nazi war criminal who was active in the Middle East, in Egypt, and in the Arabian countries, and he was active with Aristotle Onassis. I think these things are important pieces to a big puzzle for this reason. Schock was the man who was responsible for financing and seeing that the money of Germany went to this young soldier known as Adolf Hitler, and he was instrumental in helping rearm Germany and set up the whole scene for World War II. And as soon as World War II was over, Schock played an instrumental part in setting up Nazis in Middle East, in Africa, in South America, and spread Nazism all over the world. Another book, which I just got recently by Mr. Rees, called The Nazis Go Underground, says that shortly after Schock made his plans known about financing various countries after the war, the United Nations Commission investigating war criminals decided that Dr. Hallmar Greasley Schock was not to be considered a war criminal. The man who made Hitler's war possible, the man through years of international scheming, through years of borrowing and bartering, had enabled the Nazis to support the raw materials to manufacture their arms, the man who knew better than anybody else how many cannons and tanks each of his deals meant for Germany, the man who foresaw more clearly than anybody else against whom these guns could be used, which country the tanks would invade, this man was decided to be not a war criminal by the United Nations Commission investigating war criminals. This man believed in the master race. Schock, if he were declared a war criminal, could not be of any use to the underground of Nazis as a contact man. But as it was, he could be up front as a German industrialist. He was useful to everybody. He could meet at banks and international bank meetings in Basel, Switzerland. Again, Basel, Switzerland is named in the book Were We Controlled, and also in terms of Permindex and their funding. Incidentally, I received a letter from a listener who takes these tapes telling me about this book that he heard about, written by Mr. Rees, called The Nazis Go Underground. It was written in 1944, published by Doubleday Doran. And I wrote that down, of course. He wasn't sure who the publisher was, but told me to be sure to get it. And the mail came around 11 o'clock in the day, and around 5 in the afternoon, I received a telephone call from another friend who follows the research. She had been at the library, and there's a table of used books that go on sale for 25 cents. And she said, I picked up a book for you at the Monterey Library. It's by Kurt Rees, called The Nazis Go Underground. So that the same afternoon, I heard about that book, the book was purchased for me by another friend. A similar situation happened with another book that I was given for my birthday just a month ago. A researcher and listener gave me a book written by Mr. Kruger, The Doctor for Adolf Hitler. I was Hitler's doctor. There's an introduction by Upton Sinclair warning about the rebirth of Nazism and the resurgence of Nazis around the world. And it's an old book. Again, these books are dated and they're very valuable because they're hard to find, and you should pick them up wherever you can. And I received this as a birthday gift last month. And then another listener who takes these tapes just wrote to me yesterday. I opened her letter, and she had typed the whole introduction of Upton Sinclair from this book, told me it was an old book, it was hard to get, and I should find it. And just coincidentally or through karma or whatever, I had received it just this month. I hope the same kind of psychic energy works, and that all of you find books on Admiral Byrd and on the Argentine Nazis and early books on Onassis. I'm collecting quite a library of them, and I'm going to pass the names on to you and hope that you can pick them up, so that even though on these tapes I just give you a brief summary or a few pages about these people, that you will be able to fill in the larger spectrum yourself and go out on your own and get these books from the library or use bookstores or whatever. There are lots of ways to find these books, and they're very valuable. Now, I know a lot of listeners get uptight if you mention Solidarity or the National Labor Caucus. They don't like those people or their research. And I wonder sometimes about why they're attacked. A lot of their material that they print out, they were the first people to put out stuff on the Trilateral Commission. The Bilderbergers put it in the hands of American people. They are always warning about the Nazi network. And I wonder sometimes if there isn't a, by word of mouth, purpose to discredit them because of some of the information that they're getting out. I know that people like Lane and other researchers do that to me because of the connections that I'm making. And sometimes I wonder if we shouldn't realize that some of their material is very, very valuable and use it for what it is. And if their facts are right, don't look at the group or some single thing. If a particular member of the Labor Caucus looks like a zombie or looks like he's controlled, look at the material they're getting out and ask yourself, if it's valid material, then it's worth studying, and don't discredit them for it. New Solidarity, or their paper, New Solidarity, August the 14th, 1974, had a large article about Otto Skorensky, and I mentioned him on other tapes, the Gestapo colonel in Hitler's army. It said, ex-SS colonel directs the CIA Nazi network. This article was just sent to me by Marge Gibson in St. Paul, who sends me books and articles about these things that I'm studying and you are studying. And it's a very valuable article, and it came out in '74. And looking at the date, because it was 4 years ago, I can see where the barrage of attacks against them kept escalating and escalating. And were these attacks taking place because they were telling us something that wasn't meant to be told to the American people? I'm going to read you a little bit of this article because it's 4 years ago, and it certainly is valuable to the books and the material I'm accumulating now. It goes into the fascist terrorist attacks that are taking place in Europe, orchestrated by the CIA and NATO. It said it is fairly common knowledge throughout Europe that all the extreme right-wing and nationalist terror groups are completely integrated. The European press, especially the sensational Italian press, runs regular exposés of the neo-fascist international. The Italian Daily Stampa has rehashed the well-known fact that SS Colonel Otto Skorensky, the man who Hitler set to rescue Mussolini, was the major arms conduit to neo-fascists everywhere. It was Skorensky who brought together various groups in 1950 to form what is called the Malmo International. It was a convention that included every fascist party, every major nationalist sect, including the famous Ustashi, the Croatian fascist that Hitler used against Tito's guerrillas. Also represented were almost all groups responsible for European terror, and we might say the terrorism is still going on, and this was written in 1974. It says the SAM was a Squadre di Azione Mussolini, the Ordine Nuevo, the New Order, Ordine Nero, the Black Order, which was responsible for last week's deadly bombing of the Bologna-Rome train and an assortment of Corsican, Tyrolean, and Wallonian nationalists. Now, this is important because Versailles was bombed this last week, and they found a very unknown small group of people that they're trying to pin the Versailles bombings on. But these are Reichstag fires, just like the kidnapping of Mr. Morrow just prior to the election. You notice how all that violence was curtailed after the elections were over, and they saw to it the communists lost. This terrorism is synchronized by the Tsarist Nazis. This article goes on, as is known, the Malmo International still exists as a coordinating body. It was formed in 1950. And Skorensky, who uses his Madrid real estate firm as a transparent cover for the world's largest arms trading operation, remains the head of it. Skorensky penetrated into German Nazi circles and connections with his Latin American governments. The coverage of the open secret that Skorensky's operation always stops before it goes past the level of mere entertainment. The media never really gets into the hard facts. It says the whole operation has been and still is controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA control is best documented and demonstrated by their connections in Latin America. From the beginning, the Nazi Party had tried to exploit the fact that German emigre families dominated Latin American business, especially in Bolivia and Brazil. As early as 1925, the Nazis sent Ernest Röhm to Brazil and to Bolivia to recruit and set up their skeletal espionage operation with military figures. Alfredo Stroessner, then and still dictator of Paraguay, Colonel Juan Perón joined the network after he returned from fascist Italy, where he was Argentina's military attaché. After the Nazis seized their power, Rome's network was institutionalized by Rudolf Hess, or the Organization Foreign Organization, they call it Auslands, OAO. Hess ran the Latin American spy and Nazi sympathizer apparatus. I just read an article this week that the reason Hess is locked up still in the prison and isolated is because what he knows about Hitler's expeditions into the Antarctic, that he has to remain locked up and isolated from the world. They have a choice. They could either kill him or have him, in quotes, commit suicide, but the best thing is, as long as he's imprisoned alive, it looks like the Germans are paying for their war crimes because he's symbolic, and they just can keep him around, just like Richard Nixon is somewhat isolated, and it looks like he's paying his Watergate dues. Hess is still in prison, but it's because of a lot that he knows about his network, and they have to keep him isolated from every other single person. The New Solidarity article by M. Minicino from August 1974 goes into the Nazi agents operating in Britain and Ireland, and by 1941, they were all double agents. Their international headquarters, the American operations, were at Rockefeller Center in New York, which ran both the Allied and the Nazi spy operations. That was the Intrepid, called The Intrepid, written as a book by William Stevenson about those operations. Coordinating inter-American affairs, the young Nelson Rockefeller ran the Allied intelligence for this country. By 1944, and that's the year this book was written, the Nazis go underground. The top Nazi leadership was aware that most of their intelligence apparatus was in the hands of the English and the Americans. They went to the Swiss offices of Allen Dulles, top spook of the OSS, forerunner of the CIA, simultaneous American and British intelligence operations. Diplomats working in Spain and Portugal put on extra help to deal with lesser officers and Nazi officials. The best known part of the deal was the transfer of the services of General Reinhard Gehlen, the head of Nazi Germany's anti-Soviet espionage system, and bring his whole spy network into what became as the BND, which is the German Nazi intelligence after World War II, so that Hitler's team was literally kept intact. Now, you've heard me say this on other programs and read from other sources, but this is coming in from books and articles that are available. If you want to see it, if you want to know it and reconstruct the period, it seems the pieces have been around for a long time without anybody synchronizing them. It's identical to having various notes on a keyboard at the piano or whatever instrument you have, the way you put them together, you can create a tune and a song that's sung all over the world. And I believe that if you put this information together along with me, if you help me and help me find these books and look up these references, we can present this to Congress. And as I said before, on the other side of this tape, George McGovern is trying to decide who makes the policy of the United States. Congress makes foreign policy, or again, these Nazi German foreigners in the White House. And this is terribly important to support the idea of clearing out the National Security Council and the National Security Agency and get rid of this Galen network if it isn't too late. This article says that Otto Skorensky worked with Reinhard Galen, and he was Colonel Skorensky. He was also working, of course, hand in glove with Martin Bormann, the deputy Fuhrer. His boss was Martin Bormann over Skorensky. Skorensky was well placed within the Nazi elite because he was the son-in-law of Hjalmar Schacht, that's Aristotle Onassis' business partner, the Nazi finance minister, and the architect of fascist development, who worked with the Rockefeller family, made negotiations with Allen Dulles, and worked with Nazi intelligence and the Galen operation. It was Skorensky's idea to have Operation Werewolf, to bury and collect records that could be used in the future. Our time is up on this tape now, so I'll enclose the list of titles and books. You can do your homework and also write to Senator McGovern this week if you can. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.